Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are going to be talking about the essentially year-long struggle to get what's called the Celebration Church, that is a homophobic, transphobic church, out of renting essentially Austin Independent School District property for 52 straight weeks every Sunday, as Celebration Church held or attended to hold its services at the AISD Performing Arts Center. There was street protests every single Sunday for 52 weeks until on the 52nd week leading into the year anniversary, Celebration Church announced it would no longer be holding services through AISD property. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Candace Aylor, who is the pastor and minister of justice at the Antifa Church. Thank you very much, Candace, for joining the show.
Thanks.
If you can kind of give us a little bit of the history of what it is. First of all, what exactly is Celebration Church, and why was it becoming such an issue that they were renting this property?
Yeah, so Celebration Church is a mega church, evangelical organization out of Georgetown, Texas. The pastors came here, I believe, from Louisiana, and over a decade ago. I'm assuming that it wasn't feasible for them to establish in Austin, at that time, because their brand of religious ideology probably wasn't very palatable for Austinites. So they, started up in Georgetown. But they've had this campaign for a very long time called It Is Austin, and it's their intent to infiltrate Austin. They say from their stage, their very high production, high cost stage in their church in Georgetown, that that everyone in Austin is dead, that we're spiritually dead, that we need salvation, all these things. So this was just another step on the way to their process of trying to, they want everyone in Austin to believe the way they do, that they would infiltrate a school. And that's actually by design as well. It's part of an organization that they're part of called the ARC churches. It's ARC churches. There seem to be something, if you would equate it maybe to like a consulting firm for evangelical churches.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So they teach churches, they guide and instruct them, and I believe even financially support. One of our members found a little bit of evidence of that, but I don't know for certain. But there's definitely money exchanging hands one way or the other with ARC and churches like Celebration. And they have a very prescribed model. And what we do know is part of that model is creating church plants in schools in underserved communities. So they do the Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas with police officers giving presents and things like that. So that's kind of how they started their process of getting into Austin. And then they made it really official by deciding that they were going to hold services in school district building every Sunday starting August last year.
The whole thing is just absolutely absurd and so insidious. I mean, for sure, like the insidiousness of a church specifically making a point to rent the school or rent this school property essentially when it's the AISD Performing Arts Center. Did I get that correct, or is it?
Yeah, so it's actually a couple of different campuses. They also would rent Dobie Middle School.
Oh, okay.
So during times like Thanksgiving or during the last couple weekends before school started, they were renting Dobie also. A lot of people thought that they moved to UT campus this summer, and they did for a few Sundays, but they came back to AISD, seemed to intend to continue what they were doing. until we brought full force street activism this summer to them at Dobie. And I think that might have had some of their influence their decision to decide to leave.
For whatever ridiculous reason, I mean, I know the reasons, but like for all the ridiculous reasons, these incredibly reactionary, incredibly rich sort of factions, both of kind of the religious right and other fascist groups. I'll just say other fascist groups there. Consider Austin to be this ridiculous, like, quote unquote, communist utopia. They call it the People's Republic of Austin. Even though for all intents and purposes, I mean, it's a neoliberal city. It's like any Silicon Valley owned technocracy owned by like real estate developers and whatnot. And so, but nonetheless, I think because there are more progressive elements within the city, just by the fact that it's a kind of larger city with a pretty sizable working class population, it becomes the target of so many of propaganda attempts, violence attempts, and other of these infiltration attempts we're talking about. And there's been I think there's definitely a parallel, for instance, in the sort of techniques, what we would call quote unquote nonviolent protest techniques, whatever people would consider that to mean. But essentially the techniques used to essentially by anti-fascists to drown out whenever there's a kind of neo-Nazi rally at the Capitol, for instance, where it's about keeping the pressure up and essentially preventing people from going kind of unchallenged, even if you can't necessarily shut down a rally or shut down the service that particular week. You kind of say to the community that this is not going to go unchallenged. Can you get into basically how you kind of came to form this coalition and form this group that was keeping pressure on Celebration Church for, again, like 52 weeks. So that's an incredible feat.
Yeah, it was. Ultimately we had to figure out how to have fun with it at times, and we had to figure out how to be as creative as possible and not just stick to one script. I mean, to some extent, there were some things that were consistent, and then there were also things that we did to unnerve them. In the very beginning, the very first Sunday that they had, there was a huge response from the community. And the second Sunday, almost none of those people were there. And there, one group in Austin that had organized, and that's where a lot of people found out about it, is they had, Austin at the Austin Chronicle had written a story, and then one of the groups in Austin had created an event saying, no, we're not going to stand for this. And there were some problems with that group already that people knew about. And so I was a little bit leery of like just jumping in with both feet with that group, but I did want to go and see what was going to happen. And then the very next week, that group declared victory, quote unquote, because supposedly they won because Celebration changed language on their website about their beliefs on marriage equality or marriage or whatever. They don't believe in marriage equality. They never have. They never will. But what they didn't change was their actual policy. So verbiage on a website is very different than an actual policy that they hold. And the policy that they have says that it can never be changed by laws of the land, by vote of the body. The pastor can't ever change their policy. So it's never going to change. But when we realized that and we came back the second Sunday and nobody was there, I was like, no, this can't be how it goes down. They will have won, and that they will think that it's okay to keep doing this, and they'll start doing it even more. And a bunch of other people felt the same way I did. And we weren't all, anti-fascist organizers. We weren't, everybody that was part of the group that kept coming. I'm a member of the LGBTQIA community. Other people that are part of that community showed up because that's why they cared. Other people showed up because they felt very strongly that this type of distortion and exploitation of their religion, Christianity, was damaging and harmful. And they believed that Christianity should be loving and accepting and affirming of all people, including those of us that were born gay or lesbian or trans or queer, intersex and whatnot. So yeah, we just kind of naturally formed this coalescing of, it wasn't like we're going to build a coalition. It was more like we just kind of coalesced. We were all kept coming back. And pretty quickly after that, I was like, we would see the criticism or hear criticisms from people that, this is just religious beliefs and it's their right to have, that very, like you said, that neoliberal kind of civility. Everybody just, let people have their own beliefs. And no, that's not okay. So we didn't let Nazis continue to just believe whatever they wanted to believe. And we can't let Christo-fascists believe whatever the they want to believe either. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to.
I always love it when I get people a little fired up because I get to bleep it, I get to... Yeah, if you're just tuning in, by the way, you are listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and we are also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We're talking with Candace Aylor of the Antifa Church about the protest against a Celebration Church in Austin. So I want to also talk about the other tactics and strategies used, especially with regard to taking this to AISD, because AISD was really trying to do in many ways a kind of absolute cop out of saying that this was beyond their control to do anything about. I'm wondering, how that sort of process of engaging with Austin Independent School District started, and what sort of inroads you were able to gain, and what were sort of the challenges there as well.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of backtrack just for a second. Yeah. On that policy. On the policy, they're basically saying that we're sinful and offensive to God. They compare bisexual contact and homosexuality to bestiality, incest, pornography, sexual immorality, adultery, fornication. I'm a proud fornicator, by the way. And changing of one's sex or disagreement of one's biological sex. Their words are insidious. So I decided to turn that on its head. And we took all of the beliefs that were on Celebration Church's website and we flipped them around. And we created our own organization and said, look, it's our closely held religious beliefs that we're against homophobia and transphobia, that we're against bigotry. So it's my closely held religious belief. Now what? The criticism is, you should just allow people to believe whatever they want to believe. Okay, well, I believe that it's wrong to be a jerk.
Yeah.
So this is me responding in that manner. And the district, initially around, I want to say the end of September, beginning of October, they started trying to figure out how they could get out of the contract. And the contract was renewed monthly. So they were thinking maybe we could just not renew it. And find a reason not to. And when they started even hinting that was the route they might take, the Attorney General mysteriously sends a letter to the school district out of the blue, unsolicited from the district, supposedly, and says, if you deny them a contract, we will sue you. Similar to the actions that they've threatened regarding Chick-fil-A and whatnot. So, and there's other instances as well where the current Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, has threatened legal action for anybody that any entity, especially government entity, that tries to protect its citizens from bigotry and oppression by way of not abiding by this state's laws, which they do exist, to protect religious liberty or freedom. So this is, a textbook example of why those laws are actually probably more harmful than good. But So because the district felt like their hands were tied, and I didn't feel like we were going to win by only going after the district for not standing with us, even though I am not pleased that they didn't try to figure out a way to stand with us more. We just decided to not to sustain the protest as long as it took.
Mm-hmm.
So if, the line that we found in the sand was, the district is going to use tactics that the state is giving them to not cancel the contract. Okay, so the contract won't be canceled. These bigots are still going to be in schools. The students, the queer staff, the queer families are still going to see that there's this oppressive organization that's giving money to the district, and we need them to know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
So that's where we just decided we couldn't, we couldn't let that stand. And so I started getting really creative. It's not just that I thought, well, if we go too far, maybe the cops will show up. The cops were there.
Yeah.
They were there protecting the church. It was, their role and talking to district leadership was not to only serve the church, but it was very evident to us every single Sunday, all of the 52 Sundays, who was being protected. And it definitely wasn't us. So, the police that were there for, like when we're at the Performing Arts Center, they were very aggressive toward the people on our side. And we watched them do things like hand out Bibles to people that were coming into the church. And I mean, they were so clearly with the church.
So I just want to say the police were handing out Bibles
Correct.
to people coming into the church. Wow.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, that's rich. Where does this go from here? Not only in terms of like the church itself is now outside of Austin Independent School District. The church, they kind of have their own church. Again, if we understand this entire thing to be sort of an infiltration tactic, where it's like the church sees Austin as like this almost like Sodom and Gomorrah that they need to come in and quote unquote save. So it's like now that they've essentially so much pressure has been put again from like real truly community groups that they were no longer able to sustain that particular tactic of being within schools. It seems like they still definitely want to, continue to like try this essentially this like really disgusting, almost proto-colonialist missionary work where they're targeting especially vulnerable populations. And then alongside of that, these other kind of like reactionary sort of AstroTurf community groups are still essentially pressuring Austin Independent School District to take more reactionary positions with their school curriculum. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, both of those and what the other factors within Austin are. Like, what else do people need to be looking at right now?
There was some criticism from more moderate people, even within the marginalized communities that were affected by this, that, it's not going to be effective. This isn't how you change things. And apparently it sometimes is the way you change things.
I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right?
Right. The last couple of weekends, we would mix it up and do all kinds of different things. We would change tactics, like where we approach them, like the actual physical direction. If we approach them from the other side of the building, then we would end up in an alleyway with apartment complex behind us, and we had people come down from the apartment complex and say, "It's really loud. This is my only day off." They're like, "This is really inconvenient," and we're like, "Yeah, so is homophobia and transphobia and bigotry, and this is why we're here." And I hope that, and by and large, most of those people were like, "Oh, we didn't, sorry, we didn't realize that that's what's going on." And so we're, and then they'd go and get us coffee or something, So there was some reaching out to the community aspect. We had one person that would hold up signs every week telling people to honk. And that was really effective. We actually ended up getting more community support. We also, the last couple weeks, and I really feel like this was like the nail in the coffin. One of the group members that had been protesting with us consistently had gone to Oral Roberts University, and he had heard all of the rhetoric that they use in this kind of organization, and he decided to start flipping that on them and started like preaching over the megaphone. And one of the last Sundays that we were there, he performed an exorcism. That seemed to very much unnerve them, that he was basically saying that they were all possessed, that their homophobia was, the devil inside them, and praying for them to be released from their, I don't know how to say all that stuff. He was really good at it, but it definitely took them off their game. But that same weekend, one of our protester members, Naomi, is this fabulous, amazing, fierce Black trans woman. And she was consistently targeted by the police in AISD at these protests. It was a very constant and frustrating problem. I've been a community organizer in social justice work in Austin for years, and I'm not shocked. I know people think that this is some mecca where people are treated all equally and fairly, but the cops here are definitely racist. And she was treated horribly. And she got just so much reaction because she was very outspoken and she spoke absolute truth as loud as she could, and they didn't like it. And that same Sunday that they did the exorcism, she came in dressed with very little, wearing very little clothing. I'll just put it that way, with condoms as pasties. They just, just the thought of seeing any skin is terrifying to them. They're so repressed. And I can't say enough how disgusted and how frustrating it is to watch communities react to people that are the most vulnerable of us. And I say vulnerable as in the ones that are in the most danger of being assaulted in our community, of being physically harmed because of who they are. And just watching it unfold. And it happened again last night at the school board meeting as well. So even though we've won this fight, there's definitely, and I think that leads into like what you were asking me earlier, like what's next. So even though we won this, and Celebration Church, this horrible organization, finally they got tired of the exorcisms and the blood and the, us dancing to really awesome queer music and all of our signs, and they just finally got tired of it and went off into the sunset, and they have their own building, and that's fine. Hateful bigots are going to exist everywhere, as long as they do it in private. I do have some level of agreement that people should have free speech outside of the public venue when it's hate speech, but I call it their hate closet. Go back in your hate closet. But that doesn't mean that there's not stuff still going on that's going to impact the same people that were impacted by this church running space in AISD. The school district is currently looking at curriculum revising their sex ed curriculum. And they've already approved for it to be approved for the curriculum to be revised. But what it will be revised with and what will be in there hasn't been agreed upon. the school board meeting last night, they were, I believe it was on the agenda to discuss, but they had so many people there to give public comment that it became very contentious very quickly. And there's that same amazing fierce protester was again targeted by AISD cops at the meeting. So what we need now is for people to show up at the next meeting. I believe it's September 23rd. So the next AISD board meeting is Monday, September 23rd at 7. The people that are trying to repress what children are taught in the city, they're coming out in droves. Texas Values and an organization called Concerned Parents of Austin that are certainly not concerned with their children's mental well-being, because they're very repressive and disgusting people that, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. They need as much support as possible for people to come out and really speak up about what kind of things children should be taught. Because if children are not taught appropriate boundaries and how to, give and receive consent and some basic things, and the curriculum isn't intended to teach kids things that are not age appropriate. It's very much, the curriculum goes by ages, and it's kind of stair steps into stuff. But the reality is, as we all know, at a certain age, kids start getting curious. And if nobody's telling them how to do things or talking to them about their options, they're going to end up hurting people, or they're going to end up being hurt. Mm-hmm. And so anyway.
Yeah, this has been a really inspiring campaign. It shows that these battles are winnable. And I think that's important, that people can actually see the kind of victories that come, these kind of I want to call them incremental steps, because it's kind of changing, it can't just be the incremental steps. It has to be changing people's level of understanding of how they get involved. Rather than just you show up and you vote for this person, and that's it for the next 2 or 4 years. Your way, the way to be involved at a popular mass level has to be this kind of mass mobilization at whatever level it is you can handle. And I think that that kind of victory, that even more so than just getting the church out of Austin, but that ability to show that a mass movement is possible and a mass movement gets results, to me, is the real takeaway from this sort of a struggle. We're going to wrap it up there. We were joined by Candace Aylor, the pastor and minister of justice at the Antifa Church. Thank you very much, Candace, for coming on the show, and congratulations on getting Celebration Church out of Austin Independent School District.
Thank you so much for having me. This was good.
You have been listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Now it's time for our, once again, for our monthly segment on housing issues, featuring Maddie Detelich and Marina Roberts. This particular month, we are talking about the different housing platforms of the presidential candidates in 2020. So it's going to be an interesting episode for sure. Thank you both for coming back on the show once again.
Thank you for having us.
I think one of the key kind of things holding this segment together and holding, this particular talk together is the fact that housing has not actually been as much of an issue on the national level as it really should have been. I mean, so much energy, I think rightly so, has been focused into the kind of Medicare for all struggle. But housing itself is equally as key, because, what exactly does healthcare mean to someone who doesn't have a home? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if we can just get sort of like a general sort of overview of what it is like we can expect out of these all wonderful, like, just to be clear, every Democratic presidential candidate has fantastic policies,
such good ideas.
I know, it's just a matter of like all 50 of them have such brilliant ideas, just a matter of figuring out which one's brilliant. So on a more serious note, like, what basically like is the kind of like spread of presidential candidate kind of like policy proposals on housing?
Yeah. So, I got to be honest, my eyes glaze over a little bit at the details of some of these. So, so far, I think the people that have big proposals are Julian Castro, or by big proposals, I mean like very specifically housing plans, Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Kamala Harris, and Warren, because of course she's got a plan for that. It's her thing. But yeah, it's kind of what you would expect. Very focused on tax credits. Let's see, like Kamala Harris gives a refundable tax credit to recoup rent costs above 30% of gross income for people making under $100,000 annually for $125,000 in high cost areas. So it's like, that's...
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Right. No.
That's what we're going to be doing all night.
Oh, wow. That's so Kamala Harris, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. It's just some real inspiring stuff, Yeah, 100% of excess rent cost for people making under $25,000. Wow, but it's still tax credit.
So like essentially the tax credit goes to the person who has successfully paid rent. First of all, that's a huge deal. Like not everyone can successfully pay rent. And then, if you're really lucky, so you said it's the excess tax credit?
Oh my God. Yeah. I wish I even understood really what that meant. Like gives a refundable tax credit to recoup rent costs above 30% of gross income. So it says tax credit is more generous for people making less money. So yeah, it says there's different tiers. Gotta love those tiered policies, 100% of excess rent costs for people making under $25,000, 75% of excess rent costs. But what is excess rent cost? I think that's the gives a okay. So I think the excess is referring to the above your 30% of your gross income. Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you're paying 40%, then your excess cost would be the 10% over that.
Oh, my God.
And by refundable tax credit, what that means is that there are some tax credits that will only reduce your tax liability to zero and you don't get any benefit beyond that. But a refundable tax credit means that if you reduce your tax liability to zero and then there's sort of like extra, then that gets refunded to you in a check. And not all tax credits work that way. So this is about actually, I mean, the argument for this kind of tax credit, I would say, is generally that it helps to redistribute wealth, right? So it's like a wonky policy thing, which is frustrating because wonky policy stuff is not my favorite way to do politics, but there is like a logic behind here. And I mean, I do find it interesting to see for the first time, I think that I'm aware of, that all these presidential candidates are talking about housing policy for renters.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's a brand new thing because right now the majority of housing policy is, and to the best of my knowledge, pretty much always has been for homeowners, right? Like, real estate has just lobbied really effectively, but really only on behalf of homeowners because they want to sell homes. They don't want to, yeah.
And to the degree housing is dealing with non-homeowners, because again, like when you establish that as a baseline, when the baseline for like what American society is supposed to be is this kind of American dream that everybody's supposed to own a house, then obviously you would be pouring money. And I say obviously in air quotes here, like obviously you'd be pouring money into like trying to like keep that a reality for people. But since obviously the 2008 recession and the fact that like basically nobody recovered from that. Nobody our age, none of the quote unquote millennials have recovered from the 2008 recession. None of very, very few people actually have been able to kind of purchase houses in that time. And the people I know who were able to purchase houses are very few. And they essentially purchased houses because they were coasting on their parents' money for long enough that they were able to do that, for sure. But like, that sort of idea, like when, going back to that, like when policy did affect and when these kind of like credits did affect, any group that was not, for instance, homeowners, when it affected like anyone else, it was sort of the landlords, the builders of this or that apartment complex or whatnot. So like then it winds up essentially in the hands of like different real estate interests and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So like in much as, for instance, the Obamacare system, like it just winds up being essentially a huge handout to like the companies that are kind of involved in this but it leaves that kind of structure in place of them charging way too much for their service.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think another thing, I mean, like just to keep it going with the different policies, one big thing that you see in a lot of these platforms is the Section 8 voucher program, which if you're not aware of that, it's basically, housing vouchers that are provided to people, low income folks that helps subsidize housing costs, basically. And there's a lot of trouble with that. One of the biggest problems is that only, I believe, 25% of people who need housing vouchers actually get them. And so a couple of these housing platforms, including Castro's, I think, talks about making that program into a, what's the word?
It says fully funded entitlement program.
An entitlement. Yeah, that's it. So that everybody who needs it is entitled to it. That's how it works. Right now, it's just like a nice thing that if you're lucky, you get it. And so
that's
Castro's.
So
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the problem with a lot of this, the ways that we subsidize people.
I just can't help but jump in and point out like the idea that we would be voting for somebody because like they're promising to fund the program we actually have instead of like replace it with some kind of system that works better. But anyway, sorry, keep going.
No, you're good. That's like an underpinning thing, right? Though, like nobody is engaging with this on a systemic level. It is all Band-Aids. Every single one of these is just here are a creative series of Band-Aids. But another thing I would mention though too, that as you're going through these housing platforms and thinking about them, one thing that I do think is relevant to mention is Section 8 voucher recipients legally get discriminated against all the time by landlords. There's this thing called source of income discrimination where a landlord can legally ask you, so where do you get your money? Do you have a job or are you getting government assistance? And if you are relying on government assistance, your landlord can say, sorry, you don't get to live here. And that's legal. So, one thing that I believe Castro's program platform does, and potentially a few others, is like making it illegal to discriminate against folks based on source of income. Again, it's a Band-Aid, but I know that is actually really important for, people living with disabilities. Anybody who relies on that like needs to have an actual choice in where they live. And if you're limited to like a tiny, tiny percentage of landlords who will accept your money, it can be really limiting and put people in bad situations.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely, when you brought up Section 8 vouchers, it's like, yeah, not enough people who could be getting them get them. And then once they get them, all you hear about is this heartache, like actually trying to find someplace that takes them. So,
Are there any that actually you feel that stand out as something like a little more progressive, a little better, or a little bit more like comprehensive than the rest? Because I feel like, again, there's not that sense of urgency with housing that there is with Medicare, and I feel like there definitely needs to be.
Yeah, I was flipping through so kind of Data for Progress, this left-wing think tank put out a really good comprehensive plan on like what they would suggest a politician who was running on housing would do. And then they did separate reports on Kamala Harris, Booker, Castro, and Warren's plans, and they all fall short of what they think would be necessary to actually end the housing crisis. And one of the big things that stands out is this failure to actually list like the number of housing units, which is like something that we know. And one thing that I was excited to see last week in Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal, he says we're going to build X amount of housing units. Oh man, I swear. But
was it like the 10 million number from the People's Policy Project proposal?
I don't know if he actually, I have it in, build 7.4 million affordable housing units. So not the full, so I know I can't remember the number that the Data for Progress report put. I don't think it's necessarily, it might be more like 10 million. Is that what you said? Or?
The People's Policy Project proposal said 10 million new affordable housing units in the next 10 years. That was what they said, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's ringing a bell now. Yeah. So Bernie Sanders listed 7.4 million affordable housing units to close the affordable housing gap across the country and guarantee safe, decent, accessible, affordable housing. We will greatly expand the National Housing Trust Fund to build the units necessary to guarantee housing as a right to all Americans, which, you know, that's pretty dang cool. I don't know if any of the other ones are actually labeling it as a right. And I do like seeing it in the Green New Deal platform. As we've already discussed on this show, I think it's pretty impossible to separate housing issues and climate change. As for like on these like intertwined levels, the commute, the transit kind of issue of like people living far away from where they live and work and having to drive everywhere, and then also the like very basic element of energy efficiency, where like we have the technology to build these houses that use way less energy, but like, yeah, I'm pretty sure my crappy apartment does not fit that standard. Yeah. So being able to, so it also even in this plan details like the need to retrofit our public infrastructure to withstand climate impacts. So that's the third. There's this like web of, it's like the climate impacts, the energy efficiency, the stopping the emissions from transportation, and then repair and modernize public housing to include making public housing accessible, conducting deep energy retrofits of all public housing, and providing access to high-speed broadband. So even including that in there. And yeah, there's this beautiful line. We will also ensure that public housing has quality shared community spaces to ensure every public housing complex has the capacity to serve as a community resiliency center. So kind of a lot of layers there that I think are important to the housing conversation. And it's exciting to see public housing be embraced in that way. Like, of course, it could be more. And I'm not aware of a standalone housing plan he has. And it would be nice if he was talking more about, or if it mentioned like rent control in there or repealing the Faircloth Amendment.
Yeah, for sure.
But I did have another thing while I'm still on Bernie Sanders. Back in April, he wrote an opinion column for the Las Vegas Sun saying we cannot afford or continue to ignore that crisis in affordable housing. So that was nice. And in this column, what I really like about it, it's in the Las Vegas Sun, which I think it was intentionally in Las Vegas as somewhere that was really hit by the 2008 recession. With lots of homes being foreclosed upon there. He really touched on just how housing is directly tied to our low wages, and and then low wages are tied to our lack of worker power, which is tied to the erosion of unions. So I do like that he's talking about it in these big conversations. He brings up healthcare in here. And Nevada has the fewest number of affordable rental units of any state. I like that. I feel like he gets the complexity of the issue in a way that other candidates do not.
Yeah, like he's more kind of willing to tie it into a kind of broader socio and economic justice thing, as opposed to like, again, kind of a standalone issue, I think. And I've noticed kind of a lot of talk about that difference between affordable and public housing. And I think that's definitely something that's always important to kind of parse out. For those of you maybe just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM. Austin, and we also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking to Marina Roberts and Maddie Detelich about our monthly housing segment, and specifically going over kind of the different housing proposals and the general like housing proposal landscape and policy landscape of the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates. I don't really think we need to go into the 2020 Republican presidential candidates. Like his, I mean, I think it is worth mentioning though that around the time that we had essentially the Homes Not Handcuffs in Austin, that campaign to decriminalize some aspects of homelessness, really a rather tepid. I don't mean tepid in like an insulting way, but it was not like a radical campaign in any sort of way. And you see around the same time, because there's kind of a crisis of homelessness, a crisis of people not being able to afford their homes anymore. And so you see Trump sort of tweet out some things about, essentially like homeless people in very kind of disturbing ways, reminiscent very much of kind of our Austin's local real estate interests. Like you see that kind of political and ideological affinity there. But yeah, back to the question, I guess, sort of the difference between like public housing and affordable housing. And I think that really, if anyone's going to talk about housing as a right, because housing, of course, is recognized by the United Nations as a right, to the best of my understanding. And if anyone's going to talk about housing to be a right, as it should be, the question really becomes like, how do we ensure that public housing? Because under a capitalist system, housing, then it only really is a matter of time until housing becomes a commodity. Mm-hmm. And the point at which it's not a commodity, it becomes something to be commodified. That capitalist drive to commodify everything, like even if everyone has a house, even if everyone has a home, some roof over their head, that capitalist drive will see that as something where it's like, oh, that's a source of money. That's a source where I can exploit this. And so it really only becomes a matter of time. And so like, I'm always really, I guess, skeptical personally when people start talking about affordable housing, because what is affordable housing to a homeless person without a job? And if your answer is affordable housing, then you're really, and you can't really define that as like guaranteeing essentially that affordable means public, that housing is a human right, that that essentially a state will intervene in order to make sure that everyone has a house. If you can't do that much, then it's, affordable just becomes a meaningless buzzword, I feel like.
Yeah, when I read that line in the Green New Deal thing that was like 7.4 million affordable homes, unfortunately that word stuck to me like a little bit. I was like, oh no. But yeah, that in the next paragraph, it mentions it being a human right. And then it does talk about making public housing this like nice community space. Whereas today the association with public housing is decay and poverty, where it really could be so much more. So yeah, that definitely bugs me.
Whenever I think about stuff like public housing, about this proposal, we already know that is the answer to the housing crisis, right? Like decommodifying housing, establishing that housing is unequivocally a human right, ensuring that every single person who is a human being has access to it. But I think that's true for most of the world's problems. Somebody somewhere already knows the answer to most of the world's problems. And so what I'm more interested in as an organizer is like, how do we politically, strategically get there? So I think that, in the context of these presidential platforms, to me, one of the really interesting differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, for example. The thing that people love to say about Elizabeth Warren is, she's got a plan for everything. But I actually disagree with that. I think she has a white paper for everything. And that's something that you can just get, some policy wonks to draft up for you. You don't have to be a genius to come up with that. You can come up with a really good white paper. Like I said, somebody has the answer to all the world's problems. But does she have a plan? Does she have a strategy to make that happen? Does she know how she's going to navigate a Republican-controlled Senate in order to actually force these things through? And I think that to me is the difference between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, is that Bernie Sanders has shown himself to be a person who already understands how you kind of, you have to mobilize mass support in order to win these things. So, I mean, I think that it's good maybe in some senses to have some smaller proposals in between here and public housing, right? So like whenever I talk about winning rent control, right? Like that is, I think, a really, really good first step toward solving the housing crisis, because it's going to do two things. Like if you're going to win rent control, you have to mobilize a mass working class movement. You have to mobilize renters to go and fight for something that they should have a right to, which is like the right to stay in their homes.
I heard a great quote from an organizer, a DSA organizer in Kentucky. He was like, Mitch McConnell ain't afraid of no graphs. Like, you can't just like print up a really nice looking graph and get that past Mitch McConnell. But I thought one really cool thing about the Data for Progress housing report is that, they're not just thinking about what policies will go and fix this. They actually are thinking about the politics associated with it. So like they said, they're like, hey, why don't politicians run on a rent control movement? That's like a huge thing that they could tap into. And they had like some polling data that was like 60% of all voters were for the question, would you support or oppose a policy to build enough new nonprofit and publicly owned homes? Oh, sorry, that's not the rent control one. But there are a lot of
support.
There's documented wide support for bold solutions on housing. So like, if you could actually get people really jazzed up about it and excited and like tap into renters, because renters are a large part of the population. And and I think that just goes to a lot of what I've currently been thinking about now that the election season's heating up and now that we've got our very own candidate running for Congress, just like this difference between what is a movement candidate and what is a candidate with really good ideas but doesn't have that movement aspect, or like a really nice person but doesn't like know how to like. And one easy description I've found through DSA is class struggle candidates. So it's candidates that are able to say what the enemy is, like why these problems exist, name the enemy, and actually like agitate around that issue and build support, build a mass base of people willing to fight to get these things through.
Yeah, and ultimately it gets to like kind of the very root, I think, of where what politics is. What is a political movement, for instance? Because like we sort of as Americans are trained, or at least traditionally we're trained to sort of believe that like politics is simply like you show up and vote. And if you're really, really politically engaged, then what you do is like you might be involved in like Democratic Party or Republican Party, like different political campaigns or whatnot. But like that's it. Like that's the kind of parameters for what gets considered like political engagement. And like I think what we're seeing for sure, normally like I don't cite Jacobin a whole lot. Like generally I have some kind of criticisms of Jacobin, but like when you're right, you're right. And I think Jacobin put out a very interesting article a little while back about the difference between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, called essentially like what to make of, I think it was called What to Make of Elizabeth Warren's policy blitz. And it basically shows like, you can put forth all the policy proposals in the world, but if you don't understand the nature of power, for instance, if you're not engaging in a large larger scale. First of all, like a worldview analysis of like what power is, how change happens, et cetera, et cetera. I'll always then you accomplish nothing. Then it's just, and you know, like there's some kind of cynical readings of Warren that I think are warranted.
I'm sorry, that was funny.
Yeah, there are some warranted cynical readings of Warren that have suggested she might be trying to split the progressive vote, or that she's trying to be the more palatable candidate to the ruling class. I haven't had a chance to read too much into it, but like it seems that she's courting a lot of the super delegates in sort of a more kind of like power pandering way. As opposed to, you know, for whatever criticism I have of Bernie, they are many for sure. But nonetheless, like it's how do you go about sort of forcing a societal change? And after all, it was Richard Nixon, not any sort of Democrat, progressive or like the more regressive. It was not any sort of Democrat, but it was Richard Nixon who, instance, ended the Vietnam War and normalized relations with China. Did he do that because he was a progressive person? No. He did that because his hand was forced by, first of all, the geopolitical situation, but then also, secondly, by the state of the American anti-war movement, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, that kind of power building is something that the right engaged in, even when they were losing elections, to the point where it's like, well, the right was really winning elections with like someone like Bill Clinton. Like Bill Clinton was a victory for the right, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that understanding of the nature of power, how things move, is really important. You know, we've been talking, for instance, locally about how that plays out with different Texas political candidates. The difference between like this sort of Texas party, I think, the Texas Democratic Party trying to come in and essentially like run these neoliberals, like these empty slate campaigns, that don't necessarily like really stand for anything, where it's like you can just kind of read anything you want to onto like this person's quote unquote progressivism, versus I think the candidates who were really like, sort of, you know, enmeshed in the on the ground work. And I think a good example for that, I know, Marina, you've been working a lot on the Heidi Sloan campaign. Is the communications person for that. Yes. And I think for sure, like that represents a kind of progressive shift in a certain interesting way, and like that represents like I think to me to some degree that use of like that mass movement structure, as opposed to the like, you know, kind of Robert Francis O'Rourke type who comes in and does that. Anyway, we have to go ahead and wrap up. Are there any sort of last thoughts on like presidential housing policies or on anything else we've talked about that you'd like to just kind of get in the last like 30 seconds or so?
I would just say, like, another thing that I think a good class struggle candidate attempts to do is thinking about this strategically. Like I said, you kind of have to meet people where they're at. And if you're trying to mobilize a mass working class movement, you have to recognize that you're working with a lot of folks who don't know what it feels like to win and don't believe that they can. And you have to kind of show people what that feels like, you know? I wouldn't be the comms person for Heidi Sloan if I hadn't stood with her and fought and won campaigns, because I wouldn't have been somebody who you could have offered me this job and I would have said, yeah, sure, I can do that, you know? I think that in that sense, you know, fighting for things like rent control is a logical step to mobilizing people to fight for bigger things, to fight for public housing, to, you know, to demand something transformative. I mean, you know, and it's all intersectional too, right? We can win higher wages for workers, but if we don't fight for housing that is democratically controlled and owned by us, then that's just going to be more money that landlords can scalp off of us and our families. So we have to understand where these issues meet each other, and we have to fight all together for, you know, for democracy and for real power for the working class.
Absolutely. And that's why my guy is Joe Biden.
Yeah. Oh my God.
We're going to leave it there. We were joined. I'm obviously being very sarcastic. We're going to leave it there. We were joined by Marina Roberts and Maddie Detelich of Austin DSA for our monthly local segment on our monthly segment rather on housing issues. We were talking about the 2020 presidential candidates. Thank you both for coming back on once again.
Thank you. That was fun.
Thanks so much for having us, Marina.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.